There has always been much debate surrounding the use of nuclear energy. Proponents say that nuclear power is a clean and sustainable energy source without emitting the carbon emissions characterized by the burning of fossil fuels and produces virtually no air pollution. Opponents point to the health risks, accidents, and damage caused by uranium mining. Will you please shed more light on this deep-rooted debate? Anyone?
Who wants to start?
Sure. It doesn't matter all too much to me. Mark, did you want to go first? I think you unmuted first. If you'd like.
I'm happy if you want to go. So.
Sure. I can start off. So I'm coming from South King and East King, Treaty 72, covered by Treaty 72. I did want to clarify that I'm not speaking for IPAC, just to be clear. To me, one of the biggest things that I find isn't mentioned in the debate a lot, and maybe it's because it's my personal point of view, but I find that there's not a consideration given to the fact that most nuclear, or probably all, and a lot of the uranium mines and other things throughout the chain are actually built on Indigenous lands that didn't use free, prior, and informed consent for those communities to build the plants and the mines in those communities. And in the municipalities around those nuclear power plants, many of their economies rely on the nuclear energy industry, and it generates its own support. The municipality that I grew up in actually had the official plan consultant say that they didn't need an economic section in their official plan because they had the Bruce Power nearby. Whereas the Indigenous communities surrounding these plants don't actually receive the economic benefits for them operating in their territory. So I see that as being something that isn't discussed a lot around this and probably should be discussed a bit more.
I think those are very important points. My take on this is more that probably nuclear energy, more than any other energy technology, is kind of the poster child for the importance of taking life cycle perspectives on things. That nuclear power plants at the point of generation are, if everything's going okay, relatively clean, although they actually do leak to a surprising degree, particularly CANDUs. But the major impacts happen upstream in uranium mining, processing, milling, and the impacts there are quite significant, quite severe, and produce very large and very long-lived waste streams. Typical figure is you're probably looking at 250,000 years. Management for uranium mine tailings, for example, and quite significant air pollution releases as well at those stages, and both conventional hazardous air pollutants. And then downstream, there is, of course, the question of the waste fuel, which continues to pile up. I think we must be approaching 4 million waste fuel bundles, either in swimming pools at the Pickering and Darlington plants, or they're now, some of it's in dry storage at Bruce. But now, really 70 years into the decision to go down this path, we still have no answer in terms of what to do. And the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is the Government of Canada entity created to manage the waste, says they will need to be managed basically isolated from human contact in the environment on a time scale of 1 million years. Which, to put some context around that, if you go back 1 million years, we weren't Homo sapiens yet. So this is, you know, I mean, in a sense, we're talking about at both ends is major transfers of risks and costs onto future generations, which would violate a fairly basic principle of sustainability. The other consistent problem here, and I'm not going to get into too much depth because we'll have more time, of course, is cost. That the industry is essentially a creation of government, has always been dependent on government to finance its development, relies on governments to effectively relieve it of liability and legacy costs and accident liabilities. And it suffers from accident, security, weapons proliferations problems that simply don't exist with any other energy technology. So that sets up a very significant set of trade-offs that, yes, this may be a relatively low carbon and significant source of energy, but carries with it some very, very serious trade-offs that we may want to think about very carefully before going down that path.
I suppose that leaves me. So given there's some great points that have been made already, maybe I'm going to approach the question a slightly different way. So I think the position of opponents to nuclear energy is perhaps obvious enough. Many of us are afraid of a source of energy, which is, as Mark has told us, it's potentially dangerous at every stage of its life, extraction and production, and then all the stuff that gets left over that I suppose there's some attempt right now in Canada to deal with that. So given that, what is it that proponents get excited about? And maybe especially so proponents that are within the environmental movement, and there's now a lot of them, and maybe a growing number of them. Everybody from James Hansen to a group called Mothers for Nuclear have kind of thrown their hat into the ring of nuclear as something that should be pursued by groups and organizations that are interested in the environment. It seems to me that when proponents talk about the importance of nuclear energy, it only ever, their arguments are always they kind of like try to push aside some of the things that were just mentioned. And what really gets them excited is that it's different than the other kind of energy that we depend on. So this language that is always used, that nuclear energy is clean, it's only clean by contrast to another dirty form of energy, which of course are fossil fuels. And since nuclear energy doesn't produce greenhouse gases at the same levels, then it just has to be better. So that's why it's important to decide to use nuclear energy in place of fossil fuels. I guess one thing that we could push back on proponents is just to ask, of course, what exactly they think is clean. Because as we just heard, it's hard to believe that a form of energy that produces dangerous waste that we can't figure out what to do with, it's sitting in swimming pools next to a reactor, that it seems that it's clean. It only, that word clean comes across as it just being better than fossil fuels. But I suppose then what I have to ask is, both as a professor of environmental communication, but also as somebody in the Green Party, is if clean is really what's at the heart of those who want to support nuclear, it seems to me there's obviously other kinds of ways, cleaner ways to produce electricity, such as solar and wind. So there has to be something else going on. And really what I think it comes down to is that proponents of nuclear, what they're actually excited about is that it can produce a lot of energy and produce it more reliably, more than renewables, perhaps more reliably than renewables, and that thus it seems adequate to the task of supplying energy for households and cities and countries and so on. And if that's what is going on, then it's kind of a trade-off in the way we've just heard between perhaps imagining a solution to a problem, which is the use of coal and gas to produce electricity, sort of solving that problem with this other energy source, which is seen as somehow better than renewable sources, and the impacts are kind of worth the trade-off. So I think that's what the proponents are on about. And I would love to have more discussions about exactly why what other kinds of ideas motivate them, and perhaps what is hidden in those ideas above and beyond this attempt to address problems with using fossil fuels. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, if I can add on to what both of you said. Growing up, growing up beside a nuclear plant, a lot of the positives that I heard from people were economically related, right? You know, people worked at the plant or work at the plant and see the economic benefit of there being the power plant there. And so a lot of their arguments are very heavily based in my experience, in their own benefit from it. And there isn't a lot of consideration in the sense of dealing with the waste. It's kind of pushed off as a later on problem, if that makes sense. And it has been for years, right? So I don't know if everybody on this call has had the chance to tour a nuclear plant or has an idea kind of some of the ways that waste is stored, but a lot of it's in above ground storage, which is not a permanent solution. And Canada doesn't currently have a permanent solution for either low and intermediate level waste or high level waste. So NWMO, which Mark mentioned, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, is searching for a high level waste DGR. And there are 2 sites in the site selection process: Ignis in Northern Ontario, which is in Wabigoon Lake, Ojibwe Nation territory, and South Bruce, which is in Saugeen Ojibwe Nation territory. And OPG also is searching for a solution for a DGR, they were searching for a place for a DGR for the low and intermediate level waste. But that actually was turned down in a vote by SON, Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, in 2020. So now they're searching for new solutions. And I'm not actually sure what they're thinking those new solutions will be, other than having a DGR. But it's an interesting discussion around to have with proponents around what they think will happen with the waste, because a lot of it ends up becoming very theoretical, and I don't find that I've heard a lot of significant solutions there, either in the studies and ways that it's handled internationally, or with people that are proponents of nuclear.